I think in the program, this talk is under the pretentious title that I gave it in a Facebook conversation with Nick, What Editors Should Know, which I somewhat regret because it makes it sound a little bit more grandiose than it actually is. What I thought I would do is talk a little bit about my experience with some of these questions when I was editing the literary journal Overland, how they arose and how we tried to tackle them, and then perhaps draw out some of the implications that might have for other people, particularly if they work in the media. And in order to do so, I'll need to talk a little bit about Overland, the literary journal that I edited for 7 years or so, just to provide some context for what took place. Overland is one of Australia's longest functioning and most prestigious literary journals, founded in 1954 by Stephen Murray Smith and a number of other members of the Communist Party at the time. It was very much associated with the literary infrastructure of the Communist Party, so the realist writers movement, and a whole series of things went along with that. It was committed to the notion that ordinary workers, members of the working class, should both write and consume literature, that political writing should be connected to a political movement, and so the political essays that Overland published would also be read by the same people who were reading and writing poetry and fiction. And thirdly, the mode for the production and consumption of political literature was socialist realism, or in the Australian form, social realism. So there was a whole organisational structure and also ideological framework that went along with the formation of Overland. Of course, founded in 1954, was immediately impacted by the Hungarian events, and most of the key people of Overland left the Communist Party. And so the politics of the journal were communist politics moving away from communism towards a kind of broad left social democratic position. And that's quite important in terms of what I'm going to talk about today. It was also impacted by the upsurge in political activism in the 60s and the 70s, to the extent that it took on some of the ideas of the New Left, particularly those of the new social movements. But it never particularly focused on Israel or Palestine. And insofar as it did, the politics of the early editorial team and the people around them was essentially the sort of soft Zionism that was associated with the Communist Party. But also, in the broad left at that time, there was no sense particularly that Zionism was an issue on which people had to take a position. So if you actually go back through the early editions of Overland, it's not something that's ever really debated. If you ask people about it, they were broadly supportive of the idea of Israel as a homeland for the Jewish people, and then had some issues about the treatment of Palestinians. But it was never something that was particularly debated. Then Murray Smith died in 1988. By that time, Overland had become very much part of the literary mainstream. You remember, it's a distant period now, but in the 80s, it seemed like the Labor Party had become the natural party of government. And he was a journal that was associated with social democracy, so there were sort of institutional ties being formed. After Murray Smith's death, however, a new structure was set up, the OL Society, to keep the journal going after his death, and for it to be governed by a group called the OL Society Board, in which members of the Murray Smith family still had a controlling issue. So, okay, that's the context in which I became editor in 2007. Now, at that point, the journal had several things going for it. It was very prestigious. It had published everyone from Patrick White to Peter Carey to, I don't know, just about everyone in Australian literature. It had a big name recognition. The negative aspects of it, though, had a very small circulation. It was in deep financial trouble, and the editorial, the board behind it, was not very politically cohered. So I came to the journal from a background in left-wing politics, and my orientation immediately was to make the journal far more focused on politics, partly because I thought that there was a space there for a literary journal that had a political orientation. And we began to publish online, something the journal hadn't done before, which allowed us to begin to publish more activists and to intervene into activist debates in a way that a quarterly literary journal can't do. Now, that meant we began to attract around us a whole series of talented activists. But again, we saw the journal as a place where the far left and the liberal left would debate, which meant we had no particular party line on issues and we had no particular focus on Israel-Palestine. Nonetheless, it was something that came up because we were publishing activists. And in particular, we published a series of debates between Ned Kurthoy, Anthony Lowenstein, and Michael Brull, and a series of others to do with BDS and other issues. And that was the context for a letter that I received on the 20th of April 2010. It wasn't a letter for publication. In fact, it was quite explicitly not for publication. It was sent to the OL Society board, of which I was a member as an editor, and it was signed by the following people whose names you'll probably recognise: Professor Bernard Rector, Professor Douglas Kirstner, Professor Andrew Marcus, Dr. Bill Anderson, Dr. Nick Dyrenfirth, and Associate Professor Philip Mendez. And I will read some of it. Dear members of Overland Editorial Board, we are writing to express our grave concern about your journal's unbalanced coverage of Israeli-Palestinian issues in recent years. We strongly respect Overland's tradition of providing a forum for free and open discussion of democratic and progressive ideas, but the recent biased and prejudiced coverage of Middle East affairs has the potential to bring Overland into serious disrepute. We can all agree that the Australian left has no consensus on this issue. It's fair to say, though, that a wide majority on the left today support a two-state solution which encapsulates recognition of both Israeli and Palestinian national rights. It's also fair to say that those fundamentalists who advocate the elimination of Israel and its replacement by an Arab state of Greater Palestine represent a small, if sometimes vocal, minority. Yet it's precisely these marginal views which demonise Israel and infantilize the Palestinians that seem to have captured Overland's agenda in recent years. Our principal question is why Overland has chosen to highlight these vexatious voices who contribute fanatical polemics and represent nobody in either the Jewish community or the left, and have chosen to ignore or actively censor the large group of Jewish and broader left voices who are able to present serious contributions on the complexity of the conflict. We specifically question why the editor, me, published the article from Michael Brull without taking a basic duty of care to ensure that his arguments were free of falsehoods and libel. I think Michael is here somewhere, but anyway, there are a few things that are about this that are worth noting. Mendez and Dyrenfirth had been involved with Overland. Mendez had published in Overland before I was involved in his capacity. I think his actual field of study is welfare, and he published a couple of articles on that. We had then refused to publish some of his articles accusing everyone of anti-Semitism, and I think that was one of the issues that had prefigured this response. Dyrenfirth had been quite deeply involved in the journal. When I first met him, he was doing his PhD in Labor history. He was on the left of the Labor Party, had no particular issue in Israel-Palestine. He was even involved in a group blog that I was helping to moderate. Then he reinvented himself as a right-wing Labor Party member and a campaigner, a pro-Zionist campaigner. But what was kind of significant about this letter was that a whole bunch of the names had been added because of their association with the journal in the distant past. And the reason for that was it was a letter not to the readers of the journal, but it was to the Overland Society board, many of whom had been there since 1988. And the whole point of it was not to convince the readership about these ideas, but to enforce a bureaucratic discipline on the editorial team. And I was quite concerned about this. My predecessor, Nathan Hollier, as editor, had told me whenever he published something about Palestine, he would often be contacted by people associated with the old history of the magazine saying that Stephen Murray Smith would be rolling in his grave about the issues that were being published. I thought there was a fair chance that the board would side against me on this issue. And if that happened, I think there was also a fair chance we would lose our funding, and the resulting ructions could very easily have brought the entire magazine down. So right from the start, I knew that I wanted to write a response, and right from the start, I knew that I wanted it to be public. This letter had been private, explicitly so, and I said that I was going to publish it, and I was going to publish it alongside a response. And I put that to the board, not knowing what their response, how they would react to it. They were overwhelmingly enthusiastic about the idea, much to my surprise. We published a very long response that all of the editorial team, again to my surprise, voluntarily put their name to it. And I'm not going to read it in length because it's quite, like, how much time have I got left? 10 minutes, okay. We published a long response, and I'll give you a sort of gist of it. A few days ago, we received a letter, published below, signed by 6 Australian academics, and we went through the names of them. We make the allegations against us public, partly because they are too serious for closed-doors insinuations, and partly because by seeking to exert organisational pressure on editorial policy, the letter illustrates in a small way the obstacles to debating Israel-Palestine in this country. We then discussed the allegation that Overland, under my editorship, was biased. I said that let us begin with the obvious point that accusing an overtly political journal of bias makes no sense whatsoever. In fact, when Overland was formed, the original slogan of it was taken from a Joseph Furphy text. The masthead of Overland said, "Temper democratic, bias Australian," which made more sense in the context of the time. But the idea that that it's a bad thing for a political journal to be biased just sounded like is an absolutely crazy point. But we went on to say, we suspect that employing words like bias, prejudice and demonise, Mendes and co. intend to apply something rather darker, that the Overland editorial team is anti-Semitic. If that's what they mean, they should come out and say so. For the record, any allegation that we publish, accept or otherwise endorse anti-Semitism or any other racial discrimination is scurrilous, and we reject it entirely. Then we went on to discuss the idea that publishing minority views constitutes censorship. This notion is truly bizarre. Let's put the question specifically. Are Mendes and co silenced? Do they or their co-thinkers lack forums in which to expound their ideas? For the sake of brevity, let us merely consider their access to The Australian, the country's only national newspaper. A quick search through the archives reveals the following. A piece by Nick Dyrenforth on 16 March 2009 accusing leftists of anti-Semitism. A piece by Nick Dyrenforth and Philip Mendes on 13th May 2009 accusing leftists of anti-Semitism. A piece by Nick Dyrenforth and Philip Mendes on 19th September 2009 accusing leftists of anti-Semitism. A piece by Nick Dyrenforth and Philip Mendes on 11th November 2009 accusing leftists of anti-Semitism. At that point, our patience began to wane somewhat. But let us think for a moment what is being argued here. The signatories to this letter are, as they take pains to remind us, professors and academics of one variety or another, ensconced in well-paid jobs at universities around the country. Many of them are widely published, most have regular access to the mainstream media. But when Overland prints an article by Michael Bruhl, a young writer with none of the resources or institutional backing they enjoy, they complain to its governing body that they are being excluded. They assert their right to berate their political opponents in the most vituperative fashion, but they also want, in the name of free speech, to deny those opponents any platform whatsoever, even in a tiny literary magazine. We then went on to talk a little bit about some of the people who were on that list, who included Douglas Kirstner, who I don't know if any people here know Doug Kirstner, one-time member of the Melbourne University Labor Club, but a recent publication of his included a piece in The Australian accusing the ABC of being taken over by cultural Marxists, and another piece where he said that Janet Albrechtsen was a great asset to Australian political life, and that he concluded it by signing it, "Good on you, Janet." So we finished. We understand that Kirstner did at one stage belong to the Melbourne University Labor Club back in the days when leftism enjoyed a certain fashionable cachet. Since then, however, he's evidently picked himself up and returned more or less unscathed by his radical experiences to the traditional Toryism of the professoriate. Of course, Doug Kirstner's political evolution is a matter between him and his conscience, but are we seriously to believe that a man who sees in the ABC a tide of radicalism that should be reversed, a fellow who shouts "keep it up, Janet" in support of an Islamophobic far-right columnist, really respects the Overland tradition and wishes the project well? And we made that point to make the argument, why were they including him on this letter? Why were these so-called leftists who said that they wished the Overland project well teaming up with someone like Kirstner, who's a clear, a member of the far-right? The reason was because, as I said before, they weren't trying to convince the readers, they were trying to introduce institutional pressure to force the structures of the magazine to shut down the editorial team. When we published that, and it goes on and on, I thought the shit would hit the fan, to be perfectly honest, and I thought that would probably be the end of my editorial career at Overland, but actually didn't. We were inundated by support, particularly by younger readers. And in fact, this incident, fairly trivial as it may seem to outsiders, was something of a turning point in the history of the magazine because it established our editorial independence. It also established Overland as a magazine of the left and broke those ties with an older right. It did waste a huge amount of our time, and that's one of the things that these interventions are supposed to do. They're supposed to tangle you up in responses and waste a huge amount of time and wear you down. But what conclusions might we draw from this? Well, I think that anyone who is in the media now will have to face the question of Palestine. In the history of Overland, that wasn't the case. It was perfectly possible to be radical on everything except Palestine, and to be Palestine a question that reasonable people on the left would disagree, as people in, as the broad left in the 60s and 70s might have said. That's not the case now. So if you're involved in the media, particularly involved in the leftist media, this question will come up and you will have to take sides. So that's one of the things I regret about this whole incident, that we should have been more prepared. We had published some material on Palestine. If you look through the people we had published, some of the articles are very good. They're predominantly from young activists from a Jewish background. We published no Palestinians, and we published very few people from, the Arab community or elsewhere. So, we should have been better prepared. But, okay, I do think that if you put this argument to the people, if you take it out there and put it to the public, you can win the argument. One of the reasons is I think that BDS has changed the way these arguments are now expressed, because the argument becomes an argument about rights, about campaigning for rights in Palestine. It's much, much easier to get a hearing for a pro-Palestinian position. If you think in our case, that letter that we responded was essentially an argument for free speech, right? It was not a particularly radical position, but because of the way the arguments about Palestine now come up, by putting forward that argument, you force the right-wingers attacking you to essentially replicate the kind of repressive stances that the Israeli state takes. And that meant it was very, very easy for younger people in particular to identify with us and to see the people attacking us, not as the leftists they claim to be, but as members of the far right. And I thought that was a point that Gaston Hage made this morning that was really valuable. These days, Zionism is associated with the far right. And for a younger generation, that's how it comes across. So if you work in the media, the best way of surviving is to trust in your readers. The way that they will attack you, however, is not in the public array. In the public arena, they will attack you on an institutional basis, because that's the basis on which it's much, much harder to defend. That was why they went over the OL Society board rather than us publicly. And the response to that is twofold, I think. You can build a popular base for yourself by, the support of your readership. The second thing that matters, however, is to try to generate some kind of institutional independence. One of the reasons we were able to do so was that at that time, Overland was doing very well. Our circulation was increasing rapidly. We'd managed to turn around the financial situation, and that had given us some independence. That's not always going to be the case with people in the media. And I guess the broader question is that if we, going forward, the best way to tackle this question in the media is to build up an independent media that is independent of the kind of financial pressures that the commercial media will come under. I'll finish that point.
I am going to pick up really on several of the points that the last speaker was making, and I suppose start with the conundrum, which is the gap on this issue, and it's one of a number of key issues where this is the case, between what can be gleaned or perhaps demonstrated about the state of Australian public opinion, and on the other hand, what we might still discern as the centre of gravity of political opinion and published opinion on issues pertaining to Palestinian rights and the situation with the Palestinians. What I will attempt to do is to recount a couple of episodes which may give rise to reflections on how that situation is maintained and sustained. It's not surprising, essentially, that a state such as Australia does not somehow magically express or project the views of its own citizens on a contested topic where a lot of powerful economic interests are involved. In fact, the phenomenology is rather the reverse. We should probably expect that as a fairly routine matter. But what I'm going to do is try to suggest one or two ways in which that dynamic and the way it is sustained can be conceptualized, and then really end by asking the question, how useful is that actually? How useful is that? What does it tell us? What clues does it supply us with as to how we should go forwards in the space of activism in order to, as Ghassan was saying this morning, at least make the oppression of the Palestinians a little less oppressive, if nothing else. And I shall start by returning to, I suppose, a hornet's nest that I inadvisedly poked a few years ago, which was the defenestration of Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister. Now, when I arrived in Australia in 2007, the political atmosphere felt rather different. The grave of the Howard government was being prepared for us all to dance on. And one of the first things we did was take part in a demonstration led by Stuart Rees as a deputation from Sydney, joined a demonstration in Canberra at the opening of Parliament, demanding the return of David Hicks. And it was, as if by magic, it was the lead item on that night's television news because it prompted a sort of outbreak of panic in the Liberal Party room, demanding of Howard that he contrive some way for this to be brought about in order to remove it as an inconvenient issue in the upcoming election. And then Rudd, at the Kevin 07 moment, took over, as you will recall, and Labour had the political savvy to do some quite important things very early on before anyone could really interfere, signing the Kyoto Protocol, for example, issuing the apology to the stolen generations. And before too long, Rudd began to at least take a few baby steps on behalf of the Australian government away from what had been its reflex obeisance to Washington on matters of pertaining to the Palestinians. And one of them, for example, was in one of the traditional kind of bellwether of these issues, which is the regular votes at the United Nations General Assembly. And as you will recall, before too long in the period of the Rudd government, so-called Operation Cast Lead took place, and there were two votes in the UN General Assembly. The first one was to refer the Goldstone report, or the fact-finding mission report, of those events to the Security Council, and Australia voted against. And then the second one was to ask both Israel and Hamas to conduct their own investigations into war crimes allegations pertaining to their respective sides of the conflict. And Australia switched its vote from an oppose to an abstain. There's a kind of infinitesimal gradation of diplomacy, but it was enough to prompt this headline in the Sydney Morning Herald, whose political editor at that time, Peter Hartcher, was a journalist positioned very close to Rudd and his government. It says, as you can see, Australia abandons Israel in UN vote, and it says that Australia has softened its traditionally staunch support for Israel and the United Nations on that particular issue. Roughly at the same time, there was the fake passports affair, where Israel used the passports of various other countries to infiltrate its agents into Abu Dhabi to assassinate a Hamas operative there, and Australia was one of these 7 countries. And the 7 countries adopted in response either a kind of hardline or a softer response. The softer response was to call in the local Israeli ambassador for a dressing down, and that's what the French and Germans did, for example. The harder response was to go the further step of expelling an Israeli diplomat, and that's what Australia did, interestingly. So this began to give rise to disquiet, as you can imagine, among supporters of the Rudd government who were close to Australian Zionist organisations. And Hartcher reported in the Sydney Morning Herald in a piece with the memorable headline, "What Am I, Chopped Liver?" that the Jewish community was now declaring itself too busy to join in fundraising for Labour's re-election campaign at the election of 2010. Now, I had a meeting at that time with a guy who was on a visit to Australia from the Washington office of the Arab League. And he told me in private that these steps could be partially attributed to Rudd's. Rudd had a kind of hobbyist's enthusiasm for getting Australia a seat on the UN Security Council, and had been told by the Arab League that his chances of getting votes from their members would be enhanced if Australia was no longer seen as a kind of offshoot of the White House when it came to Israel-Palestine issues, and this is partly what was responsible for this strange voting pattern. Of course, Rudd wasn't in the lodge all that long before he crashed and burned, and the hornet's nest I poked at the time was to note in an article for New Matilda that this modest diplomatic initiative was one of the little noticed casualties that came down with Rudd. And the character of that was presaged, I think, in the days immediately following the launching of the Operation Cast-led attack on Gaza, which was propitiously timed in the days between Christmas and New Year, as you may recall. And Rudd had been prevailed upon to have a holiday, and standing in for him was his then deputy, none other than Julia Gillard, who characterised the attack as, no more than Israel just exercising its legitimate right of self-defense. And when Gillard therefore took over from Rudd, these baby steps were swiftly retraced, unfortunately. And this Australia came, as it were, back into the fold. While Rudd was still Prime Minister, Gillard, as his deputy, then went ahead with a plan that had obviously been quite long in the making to lead a deputation to Israel of politicians from different parties. So it was a cross-party deputation, along with a number of leading figures from the business community in Australia, with the express intention of enhancing commercial and economic ties between the two countries. And she was greeted as having been almost alone in standing by us by her hosts there. And one thing that was noticeable, scrutinising the transcripts of her speeches and press points, was that the word Gaza never once cropped up. So she studiously avoided the subject. Now, at the time, as we subsequently found, manoeuvring was already underway to ease Rudd from this veil of tears and replace him with Gillard as Prime Minister. And one of the sources upon which we can rely for that is WikiLeaks. One of the WikiLeaks disclosures pertaining to Australia concerned the role of then factional leader of the New South Wales Right, Senator Mark Arbib. And Mark Arbib was unmasked by the WikiLeaks disclosures as a confidential source for the US Embassy in Canberra, and the character of his briefings to his handlers on cabinet-level Australian politics was effectively dissing Rudd and his capabilities and instead lionising Gillard as a person to take over. And then, if you like, the wish was father to the deed, because Arbib was a numbers man in the leadership spill, which saw Rudd replaced by Gillard. I couldn't quite find the famous picture of Gillard smiling behind Rudd's back, but I think you can get the effect from this particular one, which actually was later after she'd appointed him Foreign Minister. So that was one of the little-known casualties. So Australia then kind of switched back to the path of righteousness and came into conformity with the Howard era voting pattern in these periodic votes at the UN General Assembly. And that's just one signal of what's going on. Then later, as Rudd put himself beyond the pale, Gillard, I suppose, was manoeuvred into a position where the only credible candidate to succeed him as Foreign Minister was Bob Carr. Cometh the hour, cometh the hero, effectively. And Carr was a kind of one of these, stars that blazes brightly across the firmament and then kind of winks out, but not without this kind of valedictory memoir, which he published in some would consider in decent haste, called The Diary of a Foreign Minister, in which he does reminisce and shed some light, I think, on what I'm talking about, the modalities by which these kind of shifts are brought about. And he refers in it, and he was obviously expanded on this point when he was interviewed about the book and its launch, he refers in it to what he calls a falafel faction of pro-Israel Labour MPs. I'm not entirely sure he was making a point about cultural appropriation of traditional Middle East foods, but he doesn't say hummus faction, he says falafel faction, including some of the usual suspects, Mark Dreyfus and Michael Denby. That's all above board. There's nothing wrong with that. It's all above board. Everybody knows where these guys are coming from, so we can make allowances accordingly. But in it, he published text messages that he had exchanged with Gillard when she was Prime Minister without her consent, because he said it was in the national interest that people should know about them. And he says the public should know how foreign policy gets made, especially when it appears that the Prime Minister is being heavily lobbied by one interest group with a stake in Middle East policy. And these tensions came to a head, as people may recall, in yet another vote at the UN General Assembly, this on the question of whether Palestine should be accorded observer status at the United Nations, when Gillard was very strongly minded to cast Australia's vote against that, whereas Bob Carr took, I think, some justifiable pride in the successful attempt that he made to divert that instead along the path of an abstention rather than voting against. What's quite interesting, I think, is that this was an occasion, a little bit like the occasion when I published my piece in New Matilda, where it unleashed a kind of tidal wave of protestations by people in and around the pro-Israel lobby in Australia, disavowing any kind of such influence as attributed by Bob Carr over the policy-making process. So the same Michael Danby took to the airwaves to scotch his claim, saying that no lobby in Australia, I understand, has that kind of influence. His claim is laughable. And let me just share with you briefly. I mean, one of the people who contacted me and contacted New Matilda after I published that piece a couple of years earlier was somebody who said that, this might amuse you, Rudd didn't lose his position as Prime Minister because of anything to do with Palestine, but because he was a devious, how shall I put it, see you next Tuesday. And therefore sort of alienated many of his colleagues. So there's a kind of disavowal of this kind of instrumental, or if you like, a disavowal of intentionality in the way in which this influence that Bob Carr is referring to is constructed and transmitted into the policy-making process, which I suppose leaves us in the unfortunate position of appearing to be a conspiracy theorist whose theory has been refuted by the supposed conspirators. But I'll just make a brief excursion, therefore, into one or two ways in which people involved in the study of political process over the years have tried to conceptualize the construction and transmission of influence or generative force on political process, with reference to some well-known academic analyses, and then after that we can think how far that gets us. And people who think about power and political agency, there are many of them, but I've just named three here of the best known: Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, Stephen Lukes, a political scientist from the United States, and Manuel Castells. And the way I sometimes try to explain this in classes, for example, is that you can begin by asking yourself, how does stuff happen? What makes stuff happen? And you can conceive of it as a continuum with a conspiracy at one end and coincidence at the other end. And there are coincidences that just happens. But the interesting bits are the bits in between. As Foucault says, there is no power that is exercised without a set of aims and objectives, but he cautions us against looking for what he calls the headquarters that presides over its rationality. Now, there are, in the same passage, this is from a book called The History of Sexuality, there are examples of what he calls, in the same passage, the local cynicism of power. And it's a phrase that could have been coined for someone like Mark Arbib, for example. Very exemplifies the local cynicism of power. But nonetheless, there is a kind of greater exertion of agency or generative force around and between the Mark Arbibs, which is always already there whenever any specific action takes place. And Stephen Lukes, in his essay, Power, a Radical View, cautions us against the conspiracy theory, that if we are only going to seek the overt words and deeds of identifiable actors, there is much we would miss. We would miss their, not if we're only on their overt agendas, we'd miss their hidden agendas. That's the second dimension. And this is the third dimension. The bias of the system can be mobilized, recreated, and reinforced in ways that are neither consciously chosen nor the intended result of particular individuals' choices. And it's that mobilization of bias which is ongoing and around us and between us all the time. And that is, if you like, the sea in which we are swimming as activists for the rights of Palestinians. I use the aquatic metaphor advisedly to link with another equally well-known account by the sociologist Manuel Castells, who coined this phrase of the network society, in which flows of power, that is to say, something like a briefing by Mark Arbib to the US ambassador, or a text by Julia Gillard to Bob Carr, these flows of power are of comparatively lesser importance when accounting for the generative force that makes things happen than what he calls the power of flows. The power of flows. So it was trying to divert the flow to the Overland board, for example, which was the much more important and potentially influential portion of what happened to Jeff, than even the content of the letter, which was, as you rightly pointed out, rather negligible, rather nugatory in comparison. So the power flow is more important than flows of power. So it is into that we step. And whenever a particular incident or interaction takes place, we step into these flows of power, which have their direction, their dimensions, their characteristics, their colors, their textures, already constructed by the time we step into them. So that's one way in which we can view, or one way in which we can explain this otherwise slightly curious phenomenon that it appears so difficult to get the state of public opinion on this topic and make it bite, make it incident and have it transmitted into these kind of political processes or even into institutional processes. Which brings me back home to the good old University of Sydney. We've mentioned the funded fellowship schemes with the Hebrew University and the Technion University. The Technion is notorious for the role of its engineering departments in weapons development, but it also hosts the Samuel Nieman Institute, which is a kind of academic think tank. And a few years ago, it was commissioned by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs to write a report on public diplomacy. And public diplomacy really, from the point of view of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is a way of changing the subject, or changing the word association, so that when people in the international community hear the name Israel, they do not think, yes, oppression of the Palestinians. Instead, they might think, yes, advances in hydroponic agriculture, or, yes, what an enterprising film industry, this kind of idea. And in order to carry out this public diplomacy, the Nieman report recommends cozying up to what it calls beneficial clients, a list headed by educational institutions. So maybe we are back to that kind of intentionality. Maybe there is a degree of conspiracy underway, which lies behind, what did Nick Riemer call it usefully in his article in the Australian smartwashing? The attempt at smartwashing Israel's reputation, and maybe Sydney Uni is being used in this public diplomacy. Brings me to the Colonel Richard Kemp meeting in 2015. And at the Colonel Richard Kemp meeting, Kemp is a retired British Army officer who attained notoriety as an apologist for the so-called Israeli Defense Force. Very much of the status of Ghassan's Rapture Man. And just as the Rapture Man believes the jury is still out on global warming, so Richard Kemp is quite prepared to stand there and argue that 2 + 2 = 5, and that the IDF is the most moral army in the world, and so forth. Selective empiricism, definitely a hallmark of his contributions. I'm running out of time, so just briefly, a demonstration interrupted his speech. The university, the institutional entity, stepped straight in to the stream, the flows of Zionist discourse with its characteristics always already underway, in order to go along with anti-Semitism allegations which were aired in the Australian Jewish News, and even in the deeply unsatisfactory disciplinary process to which you refer, the university had to accept that they were groundless, as if through gritted teeth. And the influence there was exerted through August, but I would argue that it's always already around us. And one of the consequences that flows from that refers back to Youssef Manaya's remarks, which is that both I've talked about the power of flows operating at two different levels within an institution such as the University of Sydney and in the kind of ructions and leadership spills at the top of a governing party, and that both those levels of activity have to be conceived as running in parallel. Not parallel in the sense that they never meet, but parallel in the sense that they inform one another. And you can't have one without the other, because the same generative force is being constructed and exerted at those levels at the same time. So we have to oppose it at the same time on both sides.